All right, I want to continue the discussion now on the last part of this chapter, chapter 2, and these chemistry topics. And I want to spend the last part talking about organic chemistry. And basically some important organic molecules that affect our day-to-day life. So basically, remember, when we say organic, we're referring to any molecule that is carbon based. Okay, any molecule that is carbon based. All right. So basically, when we're talking about organic chemistry, what we're talking about is, one thing about carbon is it's extremely diverse. It has 4 valence electrons. Now remember, when we say a valence electron, remember when we talked about the structure of an atom, those are the outermost electrons that chemically react with react, or I should say interact with other atoms to form chemical bonds. Okay, so because being that carbon has 4 of these valence electrons, it's able to form chemical bonds in different directions and form molecules that have a variety of shapes. Okay, so that's one cool thing about organic chemistry, is the diversity of the shapes of the molecule. Okay, and that plays a role in part in how do these molecules function, as well as their composition and their shape. So basically, another, also carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. So you're going to learn as we go through, when we talk about these organic compounds, these proteins, fats, carbohydrates, nucleic acid, you're going to learn that they're carbon based and that there are just different amounts of hydrogen and oxygen that interact with these carbon atoms. Okay, and there may be other, atoms involved in this as well. With proteins, you'll see nitrogen. You'll see phosphates with nucleic acids and some different types of fats. Okay, but in general, that's what we mean when we say organic chemistry, carbon chemistry. Okay, basically carbon-based molecules. All right, and so a little bit of terminology down here. When we say that organic molecules, they're either found as polymers or monomers. Okay, when we say monomer, we're saying an individual molecule. Mono, one. Okay, one singular unit. Okay, so for example, a glucose molecule. Okay, if you want to take a look at glucose, a single sugar unit, okay, i.e. glucose, all right, that would be an example of a monomer. All right, if we want to get really specific. Give me 1 second here, folks. Okay. Now another thing, you notice I'm writing these, these OHs, these hydroxyl groups, these hydrogen ions. Okay. Now you'll notice I'm writing these on here, and excuse me. What these are what are called functional groups. Okay, so basically what you'll notice here, these carbon-based molecules, they basically form these various rings or different shapes, again, because of the diversity of the bonding that carbon can undergo. So organic molecules, like I said, they take on these specific shapes, and then what happens, there are various functional groups that can attach to these certain molecules, and obviously you can probably deduce why we call them functional groups. It'll affect the overall function of that molecule. Okay, and by rearranging these functional groups and these carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, we can rearrange the overall composition of a molecule. We can convert carbohydrates into fat for storage purposes, amino acids into energy utilizing molecules like ATP. Okay, so keep that in mind, that we can rearrange these organic molecules for specific functions as well. Okay, but that's all organic chemistry. I mean, again, in a very, very general nutshell, what organic chemistry is all about. Okay. So let's kind of go through and talk about some of these individual organic molecules you find in the body. Okay, and I want to talk about proteins just because everything we've been talking about up to this point, chemical reactions, pH, water, gels, all shapes, all tie into these proteins right here. Okay, so proteins, what they are, they're polymers of amino acids. Okay, so let's talk about this bullet point here for a sec. So again, when we say polymers, a polymer is, so remember, a monomer is one unit, so a monomer would be, one amino acid. Okay, but when we say a polymer, we're talking about, two or more, because remember, poly in medical terminology means many. Okay, so what we're saying here are many amino acids are linked together. Okay, so amino acids, you need to know, are the building blocks, okay, of proteins. Okay, proteins are just chains of amino acids. Okay, and basically the type of bonding that occurs between the amino acids is called peptide bonding. A little more terminology again. When you see the word peptide, you should automatically think protein. Okay, peptides are proteins. Okay, so basically we form peptide bonds between these amino acids, and then we now have a protein. Okay. Now amino acids themselves, these, again, these are carbon-based molecules with hydrogen, oxygen, and there is nitrogen in there as well. Sometimes you see sulfur and phosphates in there, but for the most part, these are, basically an amino acid has a centralized carbon, and excuse me, and an acid group, and then you've got a unique side chain, and then you've got, let me erase that, redraw that a little better. And you've got a carboxyl group on the other side. Okay, so basically that's what amino acids look like. And so basically there's a central carbon, and then there's what's called a carboxyl group on one side and an acid group on another. Okay, all right, we can call this the amine or amino. Okay, so hence amino acid. Okay, now there are 20 different amino acids that are of importance to us, and we differentiate. Now, all 20 amino acids have this same backbone, the same skeleton. We differentiate them based on what are called these side chains. Okay, and you can categorize them into different groups as polar, nonpolar, hydrophilic, and all that stuff. Okay. But you don't need to know all that for the sake of this class. But, one thing to bear in mind about these amino acids, though, is that these amino acids are an important part of our life because this is what we build proteins out of. Okay, out of these 20 amino acids, we could say that, oops, sorry about that, folks. Out of these 20 amino acids, we could say that, I don't know, that 11 of them are non-essential, and 9 of them are essential. Okay, what this means is that, there are, out of these 20, we can make a little over half of the amino acids. The rest, the essential ones, we need to consume in our diet. Okay, if we don't consume amino acids in our diet, we're not going to be able to make proteins properly. Okay, and this is going to affect us in many different ways if we're unable to synthesize the right proteins in our system. Okay, and so, the best food source of protein is, without a doubt, meat. It's the most complete protein out there. When we say it's a complete protein, what we're saying is it has all 20, the food has all 20 amino acids already in it when you eat. Okay. So now what this means to us then as well is, okay, in order to absorb amino acids, you need to have all 20 present in your GI tract. Okay, so there are some foods out there that are incomplete proteins, like fruits, veggies. Okay, so then you would ask yourself, well, how does a vegetarian get all the amino acids they need. You can eat different combinations of fruits and vegetables and still get the all the amino acids you need. You just have to be you have to understand your diet if you really want to do something, if you really want to make the choice to make a lifestyle decision like this. So make sure, if you want to become a vegetarian, or don't go too crazy and become a vegan, but if you want to do that, you make sure you understand what the heck you're doing first, okay? Because people that have been vegetarians for a long, long time know what they're doing, okay? And a lot of people like to do this because it's convenient, because it's an easy way to lose weight. You eat less calories, less fat, stuff like that. But the problem is people don't eat the right combinations of food, and then they get sick a lot because without the protein in their diet, they're not able to make enough antibodies and keep their metabolism in check, and as a result, that's how a lot of people tend to get off those diets as well. Okay, so if you want to get into vegetarianism, make sure you know what you're doing. Okay, so that's where we get amino acids from, is our diet. Now, when it comes to understanding the structural levels of a protein, there are three major structural levels. Well, I guess we can say there's four, but when we're talking about initially making a protein, there are three major levels. Okay, so basically we find proteins in what we're saying here are how complex and what are the different shapes of the proteins that we find them in. Okay, so first is the primary structure of a protein. This is the most simple structure of a protein, and this is relatively simple. All this is just what we would call a linear chain of amino acids. Okay, so you have an amino acid, a peptide bond, peptide bond, peptide bond. So all this is just a chain of amino acids. Okay, and I'll talk about how we make proteins when I talk about DNA and genetic control of cells. Okay, but that's all the primary structure of a protein is. Okay, just a linear chain of amino acids. Okay, and you'll find, there are proteins in the body that'll only get to this stage. There are some hormones and chemical messages that just stay that just stay at this level of organization. Okay. Now, what'll happen next, though, is what's called the secondary structure of a protein with other proteins. All right. So then, what'll happen are, as you start to get these proteins linked together. Now, remember previously I drew you an image of what what an amino acid looks like. Okay. And then you've got this. What would I screwed that up, sorry. Let me try that again. Let's try and do this in a hurry. There we go, that looks better. Okay, so then basically, remember I mentioned these side chains earlier are different chemicals. So what happens based on the composition of these, what'll happen, whether it's these side chains or these hydrogens and oxygens, that's going to affect the chemical properties of the amino acid. Now, what's really going to happen then is when we move to the secondary structure, these chains are going to start to bend and twist and coil. Okay, and you're going to start to see. Remember, I mentioned hydrogen bonding, in the very first lecture in this chapter. What's going to happen then are these hydrogens and oxygens are going to start to link together, okay, or maybe linking to some on the side chains. All right, but then what'll happen is, as we start to form these hydrogen bonds between amino acids within this chain here, that's going to make the protein start to bend and twist and coil. Okay, and you're going to form typically two different shapes, what's called a beta pleated sheet, or what's called kind of an alpha helix. They look kind of almost like a dollar sign when you take a look at them. Okay, and then so then what's going to happen next is, once you start to form these helixes and these sheets out of these different the formations, then you're going to start to basically, the protein is going to get more complex. It's going to bend, twist, and coil, and you're going to have what's called a globular structure. Okay, this is basically just a glob of protein. Okay, now you have to keep in mind that every bend, every twist, every coil inside that protein is important. Okay, because the specific shape of a protein influences the specific function of that protein. Okay, and a good example of what can go wrong with this is sickle cell, sickle cell anemia. Okay, because with sickle cell anemia, one amino acid is switched out for another. That's it. Okay, glutamic acid and the valine are switched around. Okay, so one amino acid is replaced, and just by that one amino acid being where it doesn't belong, okay, that's what causes sickle cell anemia. And then the protein hemoglobin, what it does is it takes on an abnormal shape, and then it starts to crystallize and become very hard. And then what that does is that hemoglobin hardens. It makes a red blood cell look like this, and it kind of contorts it into the shape that we call a sickle cell. Okay, so even one amino acid that doesn't belong or that's out of place can cause problems, can cause a misshapen protein and cause problems. Okay. I'm assuming you guys have heard of what are also called, like prion diseases, like mad cow disease or chronic wasting disease was a common one here in the Midwest. Or there's another one called scrapie. That one affects farm animal stock. What happens with scrapie is it's a prion. It's an infectious protein. Okay, and what that does is it gets into the brains of these farm animals, and what it does is it disrupts the protein conformation in neurons in the brain of those farm animals, and what it does is it increases activity in their itching center. Okay, so they always feel like they have to itch. So then what these farm animals do then is they sit there and they rub up against a fence post, and they're itch so bad they scrape all their hair off, and then you find them laying on the ground in a bloody mess because they scraped themselves to death. Okay, but that came about because an infectious protein altered the shape of proteins within the brain of that animal. Okay, so affecting the shape of a protein will affect the function of that protein as well. And as I mentioned earlier, when I was talking about enzymes, remember if we have too many, if our hydrogen ion concentration gets too high, when our pH becomes acidic, those hydrogen ions are going to get here in the middle of these coils. Okay, and that's going to make the protein unwind. It's going to make it uncoil. Remember, we would call that denature. It would start to denature the protein. It would alter the shape or the conformation of the protein. Okay, so then as that protein starts to uncoil, the function of that protein also starts to uncoil and go south. Okay, so bear in mind that basically once that the shape of a protein is extremely important. Okay, and as we work our way from primary to tertiary, the structural complexity of the protein increases as we're developing a specifically shaped protein. Okay, and then what the quaternary structure of a protein is, that's basically when you take a few of these globs, you take two or more of these globs, and they get stuck together. Okay. Okay, probably the earliest example of this would be hemoglobin, or the most common example you hear about in the human body is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a quaternary protein. It's four proteins that are linked together. Two of them are the same kind, alpha beta proteins. Okay, and then they're linked together, and then you form this molecule that oxygen sticks to, so we can circulate it around the body. Okay, now yes, this is a bigger structure, but it will still be affected by pH and temperature changes in the body. Okay, if our pH goes down, meaning we become too acidic, okay, like I said, those hydrogen ions are going to get in here and disrupt the shape of the protein. They're going to denature it, make it uncoil, and that means we're going to unload oxygen too easily. Okay, if our temperature gets too high, okay, remember, as I mentioned a while ago, all temperature is, when we're measuring temperature, we're measuring molecular motion. Okay, we're basically measuring how much our molecule is moving. If temperature is going up, molecules are moving around a lot more. Okay, remember, if you want to take water, you can take an ice cube, heat it up, and it melts in the water, the liquid water. And then if you heat it up to boiling, it's eventually the molecules are going to move even farther apart, and you're going to form a gas. Okay, with these proteins, if you increase temperature, that's going to increase the energy, and make these and it's going to make these amino acids, the molecules, move farther apart from one another, and that's going to also make the protein uncoil and unwind, and the same thing will happen here. It'll unload oxygen too easily. Okay, vice versa, if our pH goes, if our pH gets too high, or our body temperature gets too low, then the exact opposite is going to happen. Okay, these proteins are going to start to coil too tightly. Okay, the proteins are going to, the molecules are going to huddle together, and as a result, if we're talking about a molecule like hemoglobin here, that if these are coiling tighter around oxygen, it's going to be a lot harder to deliver and release oxygen to your body tissues. Okay. So that's why it's very critical on a daily basis that we maintain a normal pH and a normal body temperature. All right, so we can keep these proteins in check. Okay, and definitely another type of protein that's going to be greatly affected by this are enzymes. Okay, are enzymes. All right, and protein, has has a lot of diverse functions to them. Proteins give us structure. Okay, proteins are by far the most diverse molecule in the human body. Okay, which is great because there are some proteins we can use for structural purposes, like collagen. Okay. The collagen is actually the most abundant protein in the human body. It makes up about 25% of all the proteins that are within us. Okay, it's in your eye, it's in your joints, it's in your skin, it's everywhere. It's in the connective tissues. Okay, so protein gives us structure. Chemical messages, hormones. Okay, many hormones of the body are proteins. Some are very simple, some are in the primary structure, some are bigger, more complex. Okay, we can use hormones for defensive purposes like antibodies. As I mentioned earlier, like I said, those of you who are listening may have tried this at some point in time. Try to cut calories and eat more vegetables, or even try to, go into full-on vegetarianism, and you may have gotten sick after a while because you didn't get the right amount of proteins in your system, and you weren't able to fight off infections very easily. So, plus there are cells of our immune system that secrete proteins. Okay, that are used to break apart foreign cells, use as messages. Okay, so these are a very big part of our defense. Okay, we can use proteins for energy, but they're not very efficient. Okay, there's not a lot of energy within these. A big reason why is because, as you remember, you saw nitrogen on that protein. We have to expend energy just to get the nitrogen off of the protein and metabolize it so we can get rid of it, because if you accumulate nitrogen in your system, it's going to kill you. It's called nitrogen toxicity. So by the time we can actually utilize a protein for energy, it doesn't yield a lot. So proteins are not a good energy source. That's why they always tell athletes the night before a race, eat a pasta or something with carbohydrates. Well, you should be doing that 2 weeks. You should be carb loading 2 weeks before your competition, not just the night before. If you eat a lot of spaghetti just the night before, you're just going to have to poop a lot the next morning, and that's about it. So we can use proteins for transport. As I mentioned earlier, there are certain hormones, steroid hormones, that are made out of cholesterol. They're made out of fat that don't stick in, that do not bind with the water of our blood very well. So as a result, we stick these steroids to carrier proteins and then circulate them all around the body. Okay, and then one of probably the biggest and more diverse functions of proteins, they act as enzymes. Okay, and let's talk a little bit about these enzymes because they're extremely important. Enzymes are catalysts for chemical reactions. Okay, when we say they're catalysts, they don't necessarily create chemical reactions. What they do is they increase the efficiency. They increase the efficiency of chemical reactions, okay? They allow chemical reactions to occur at a much more rapid rate and with less energy, okay? So they lower what's called the activation energy for chemical reactions, okay? And basically, as I mentioned earlier, if we denature enzymes, okay, you are going to see metabolic issues. So again, that goes back to what I was saying. If you see pH imbalances, okay, you're going to see metabolic pathologies. Okay, if you see extreme, okay, temperature changes, you're going to see Metabolic issues, okay, whether it's the metabolism of a certain group of cells or the entire body, depending on where the temperature change, depending on the temperature change and what you're trying to fight off or the environment you're in, okay, your metabolism is going to be greatly affected by this. Okay, and as mentioned earlier, if we have extreme pHs or temperatures, that will cause denaturation of the proteins. Okay, now basically how an enzyme works, you're going to learn that enzymes are extremely specific molecules. Okay, whenever you see the ASE, when you see the suffix ase, that's saying that you're talking about an enzyme. Like, for example, lipase. That's an enzyme that's specific for fat, to digest fat. Okay, a protease. Okay, that's an enzyme specific to break down proteins. Okay, so you guys get the picture here. They'll let it, when you see ASE at the end of a word, that's an enzyme. Okay, and enzymes are highly specific. Lipases and proteases are not going to exchange their functions. Okay, they're only chemically designed to break down what they're named for. That's the beauty of understanding enzymes, is most enzymes are named specifically for whatever they react with, which is very nice. Okay, so basically how enzymes work. So enzymes, again, have a specific shape, and there's a certain area of an enzyme where the chemical reactions occur. So basically, most people think of enzymes for digestion, for breaking molecules down, okay? So basically, let's say you get this disaccharide, this double sugar unit, okay? And what's going to happen, there's an area of the enzyme that has a specific shape. Okay, that's where the specificity aspect comes in. That's why this enzyme is not going to interact with fat or protein. Okay, because of the actual shape of the enzyme. It's specific to its reactants. Okay, the molecules that it's going to interact with. Okay, so then what's going to happen is this molecule is going to bind to this enzyme, and this enzyme is basically going to, what it's going to do then is it's going to snap this chemical bond, and then now you have two individual sugar units, and then you'll use these for energy purposes more than likely. Okay, so that's basically all enzymes do, is they basically interact with specific molecules, and they can either make or break chemical bonds. Okay, I mean, most of the time you think of enzymes as breaking chemical bonds, but they can form them as well. All right, and like I said, this is really efficient as well, because we can reuse enzymes over and over and over again. Okay, enzymes can work very, very quickly, all right, which is good because, it takes a lot of energy to make a protein. The average protein is about 25 to 50,000 amino acids. Okay, and you have to expend one molecule of energy, one ATP molecule, for every amino acid you make. Okay, so that's a lot of energy just to make, one big protein. Okay, so that's why it's nice to be able to reuse these over and over again, just so we don't waste energy. Okay, and those are the major functions of proteins, and that's, like I said, out of all the organic molecules we're going to talk about, proteins are by far the most diverse and have the most functions within us. Okay, next, carbohydrates. Okay, carbohydrates, they're relatively simple to talk about. Basically, these are sugars. Okay, and these, we find them again as monomers or polymers. Okay, so carbohydrates have a few different functions of them. Again, carbohydrates can act as structural components. You find them in cell membranes acting as structural and identification components. Okay, the antigens, we'll talk more about those later on. Okay, but for the most part, carbohydrates are our main source of fuel at the cellular level. Okay, and I don't care what the media says out there, carbohydrates are not bad for you. You just need to eat the right ones in the right quantity. Okay, those low carb diets, people, do not try those. None of those fad diets actually work in the right way in the long run. Okay, just watch the amount of calories you eat the right carbohydrates. I'll talk more about what the right carbohydrates are in a second, but don't buy into all that BS that the media talks about. Okay, so sugars and starches. So basically, all these sugars is again they're just carbon-based. They're just carbon-based molecules, carbon-based rings with a certain amount of hydrogens and a certain amount of oxygens attached to them. The most common carbohydrate that you probably think of is glucose. Okay, what we refer to as blood sugar. We call it blood sugar because we measure it in the blood. But glucose is found all over the place in the body. Remember earlier when I mentioned that we have tissue fluid called interstitial fluid? There's glucose in there as well. But by measuring in your blood, that gives a reflection of the levels in your tissue spaces as well, because it'd just be impossible to measure it all over the place in the body. Okay. And so basically, a monosaccharide would be a single sugar unit, like an individual glucose molecule. Okay, and a disaccharide, di meaning two, would be two, pardon my art here, would be two sugar molecules attached together. Okay, and there are certain disaccharides that you find out there, like maltose, for example. Okay, maltose, you find that in grain products and in fine malt liquors and beers and stuff. But, maltose is a grain disaccharide. Okay. And then you have what are called polysaccharides. And the two most common polysaccharides that we're gonna talk about are glycogen. Oops. And starch. Okay. Essentially, glycogen and starch are they're kind of the same thing. But what these are basically storage. These are a means of storage for us. Okay. So glycogen is how we store carbohydrates in animals. Okay. Starch is how we store carbohydrates in plants. Okay, what they are, like I said, they're polysaccharides. So basically what they are, they're very long chains of sugar units. Thousands upon thousands of sugars that are joined together. Okay, and then they form branches. Okay, glycogen is a lot more complex. Okay, glycogen has more branches, more sugar units attached to it. It's just a lot more complex. Okay, so like I said, this is how animals store carbohydrates. This is how plants store carbohydrates. Now again, you hear people in the media talking about, well, starch bad for you. No, it's not. Just eat it in moderation. Okay, plain and simple. All right. So let's kind of talk about this for a second. So, well, let's talk about why we have to do this first. The reason why we have to do this, and we're going to talk about this in the next chapter, osmosis, is because let's say we have a cell here, and I have just a bunch of individual sugar units here. What's going to happen are those individual sugar units, they're going to affect the water balance, between the inside and outside of that cell, and that's going to wind up drawing a lot of water inside that cell. Okay, and what's going to happen is that cell then is going to swell and get a lot bigger, and then if that cell gets too big, it's not going to work and it's going to die. Okay, but by storing these linked together in these complex chains, okay, that doesn't really affect the osmotic pressures of the body. That really won't affect the water movement and balance, and that'll basically keep our cells in check and in shape. The main areas where you find glycogen in animals is in skeletal muscle and in the liver. Okay, those are the two main areas where you get glycogen, where you find glycogen in animals. Okay, and I mentioned earlier there's what's called kind of the bad carbohydrates, the monosaccharides. Some disaccharides are considered that as well, but basically these are what we call simple sugars. Okay. Now, people like to say that these are bad because, we don't really need to digest these, so we consume them as individual sugar units, and then we absorb them very quickly. Okay, then as a result, that's going to affect your insulin levels. That's going to stimulate you to store a lot of these as you flood your system with these sugars. Because typically, when you eat foods that have a lot of that have simple sugars in them, the simple sugars are usually in high amounts because it makes them taste good. You know, the most common one out there is high fructose corn syrup. Okay, and that stuff is really not that good for you. You know, it's gonna, you know, I mean, eating, you know, having a diet that has high levels of high fructose corn syrup or other simple sugars is not going to be conducive to good long-term health. I'll tell you that right now, because, you know, when you accumulate, you know, when you reach your capacity of glycogen in the muscle and liver, well, you're not just going to get rid of all the excess sugar, you're going to store it, and you're going to store it as fat. Okay, you're going to store it as fat. Okay, because your insulin levels are going to go up, and then that's going to stimulate the sugar to go into adipocytes, and you're just going to store that like so. And I mean, that's why you get fat if you eat a lot of junk food. Okay, plain and simple. So, and then polysaccharides. Okay, you know, basically, you know, the polysaccharides are what we call the complex carbohydrates. Okay, eating these are not, you know, you know, like I said, are a good thing. Okay, I was going to say they're not a bad thing. Okay, the reason why these are good because these take longer to digest. Okay, since these take longer to digest, because of their structural complexity, you saw the picture I doodled, the general picture I doodled on there earlier. You've got pictures of glycogen in your book. Okay, because of their complexity, these are harder and take longer to digest. So as a result, we absorb them more slowly in a controlled fashion, and since it takes longer to digest these will suppress your appetite for a lot longer. Okay, so you tend to consume less if you're less hungry, therefore keeping the body weight more in control. Okay, so that's why, you know, you shouldn't eat a diet that's high in simple sugars. I'm not saying don't eat them at all. The key to a healthy life, you know, like anything, is moderation. Okay, and also a key to the healthy life is not listening to the media and what all these bobbleheads on TV are talking about, because, you know, more, you know, if these talk show hosts endorse these people that, you know, will say anything for fame. Okay, don't listen to that. You know, get into the research. You know, get into the peer-reviewed articles. Look at the stats. Look at the real numbers behind this stuff. You can always ask me questions about this, but like I said, don't listen to what the mainstream media is saying, because they're not right about most anything when it comes to health topics. So those are carbohydrates. They're just, like I said, they're just you know, they're carbon-based units that contain, you know, different amounts of, you know, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay? And like I said, you know, the functions, you know, a couple functions, you know, our main fuel source and structure. Lipids. Okay, lipids are long hydrocarbon chains. Lipids are more complex, and they're extremely important to us as well. Okay, just like carbohydrates, you know, they're carbon-based, and they contain various amounts of hydrogen and oxygen, just a lot higher amount, okay? And some also have phosphates on them, and those are what we call phospholipids, okay? So basically, when we're taking a look at these fats, probably the simplest unit of a fat that you're going to find in us is called a fatty acid. And fatty acids, what they are, they're just these, again, I'm just drawing a very short version of this, but these are just long, you know, when we say hydrocarbon chains, okay, they just look like this. Okay, that's, I mean, a very general example of a fatty acid. Okay, and these fatty acids have different names depending on how many carbons, how many hydrogens they contain. Okay, now this is what we would call a saturated fat. Okay, it's saturated because there's a hydrogen bound to each carbon. So basically, all the hydrogens are present. Okay, if I removed one of these, okay, so let's say I remove this hydrogen and I force this carbon to double bond with this. Now this is what we would call an unsaturated fat. And what would happen, so this is what a saturated fat would look like. Okay, this is what an unsaturated fat would look like. Okay, wherever there's these double bonds that take place, it forms these kinks in these tails. Okay, and it gives them, you know, specific, you know, gives these fat specific shapes. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. That's all. That's all the differences between a saturated and unsaturated fat. Okay, and fats are hydrophobic, meaning they do not mix in water because hydro is water, phobia is a fear of. Obviously, these don't know fear, but they don't chemically mix with water very well, or at all, I should say. So fats and water tend to separate when you mix them together. You guys have all done this at some point in time. I mean, after you're done listening to this, go take a glass of water, put some vegetable oil in there, and watch it separate. Okay. Um, and fat has a lot of different functions to it. I mean, fat is our prime. I mean, the main function of fat, if there's one major function you really need to understand with fat, is our main. It's our main form of energy storage. Okay, it's our main form of energy storage. Okay, you have to remember, folks, we are animals. Okay, and being that we're animals, we are designed for survival purposes. Okay, and a part of survival is making sure we have enough energy to get through. Because I mean, you have to remember, I mean, for the human species, we're not. We haven't lived for very long in this age of convenience that we've been in. Okay, so we are designed to survive, long periods of time without energy, I mean, not without energy, without food. Okay, so if we don't eat for a while, the point of having fat is to keep our metabolism going without consuming calories, from outside our body. Okay, but if you don't eat, you will run out of fat, and then you have to start breaking down proteins, and that's going to eventually kill you. Okay, fats do give us some structure. Fats can act as chemical messages, as messages called eicosanoids or steroid hormones. Eicosanoids are very kind of short distance traveling chemical messages that influence cellular activity. I'll mention these more as I go throughout the specific chapters. And steroid hormones, I'll talk more about these in the endocrine system, but these are hormones that are derived from cholesterol. Okay, and cholesterol is another one of those things out there that kind of has a really bad reputation. I mean, understandably, because you hear about it a lot with heart disease. But cholesterol is essential to life as well. Okay, I mean, without cholesterol, we wouldn't. I mean, our cell membranes would be weaker and could potentially break apart a lot more easily, and we wouldn't be able to synthesize steroid hormones. Okay, now our bodies do produce cholesterol. Some people's bodies just tend to produce more cholesterol than others. Okay. And these are the kinds of people that need to watch what they eat. You need to make sure you eat, foods that are low in cholesterol. If you really have to take a cholesterol-lowering medication, then you have to do it as prescribed by your doctor. But realistically, the best natural way to get cholesterol down is to exercise. Okay, the mechanism isn't very well understood, but we do know that exercise does lower cholesterol levels. So, I mean, if you want to keep your cholesterol in check, eat the right kinds of foods and stay active. And when I say the right kinds of food, the most abundant form of food with cholesterol, or the food with the most abundant cholesterol, is meat. Okay, that's why people are on cholesterol-lowering diets and eat a lot of salads and not as much steak as they used to. So. And then, fat does act as an insulator. Fat is not very good at generating heat. Your muscles and your metabolism generate the heat of the body, but muscles don't insulate and store heat very well. Fat, on the other hand, is a great thermal insulator. For example, I mean, think of a penguin that lives in the Arctic. Okay, I mean, if you want to get to the internal organs of a penguin, if you're dissecting one, you're going to have to go through, about 12 inches of fat just to get into that bird itself. Okay, I mean, those animals that live in those cold temperatures have a lot of fat within them, and that's also coincidentally what they tend to eat as well. Like if you think of a polar bear, that's the first thing polar bears want to eat is the fat off of an animal, because that's also where the most calories in that animal are going to be as well. Okay, within the fat, because remember, fat is used for storing calories, storing energy. Because you remember a couple of years ago, some lady decided, I don't know, was at a zoo and got bored and jumped in and tried swimming with polar bears, and the polar bears bit her kind of by the shoulders and the lower back and the buttocks and the back of the legs. Okay, they bit her in those areas because that's where, you tend to store a lot of fat. They were going after that. So, and fat can also act as a cushioning. It can act as, if you fall down and land on an area with a lot of fat, well, that's a good thing. So, talking a little more about fat and lipids. So, let's kind of continue this discussion a little bit. So basically, when we're talking about lipids and fat, when we metabolize and break down fats, we form what are called ketone bodies. Okay, ketones are basically the waste products of fat metabolism. Okay. Now, as we burn fats on a daily basis, I mean, it would be a dream come true if we could burn 100% fat for energy. Okay, but that doesn't happen. Okay, the reason why is because we just can't clear ketones out as quickly as we'd like. Okay, your liver spends some time breaking down ketones. Your kidneys can eliminate ketones in urine. Okay, but if we burned 100% fat, we'd flood our system with too many ketones, and we would eventually kill ourselves because ketones are acids. Okay, ketones are acids, and as we just talked about, that would lower your pH, okay, and that's going to affect your metabolism. You're going to see this a lot in people who are diabetic. Okay, people with diabetes mellitus, specifically type 1 diabetes, who don't like to take their insulin. Okay, because if you don't take your insulin, you're not going to burn as many carbohydrates for energy, and as a result, you're not going to burn really any carbohydrates. You're going to rely on pure fat for your energy source, and you're going to flood your system with ketones, and that's why the condition they develop is called diabetic ketoacidosis. Diabetic meaning they're diabetic, ketone meaning they flood their system with ketone bodies, and acidosis because it's a metabolic acidosis. Okay. So that's one thing to keep in mind about fat metabolism are these, these ketone bodies, as nice as it would sound to burn pure fat, we just can't do it because we can't eliminate them quick enough if we do so. What else about fats that I want to talk about? The main storage form of fat that we find in the human body are triglycerides. Okay, these are all in your book as I'm talking about these as well, but triglycerides are our main storage form of fat, and basically what they are, they're 3 fatty acid chains linked to a glycerol head. Okay, and then you pack these together in these round oil-like cells called adipocytes. Remember, adipose means fat, and CYT means cell. Okay, so we stick all this fat inside of a fat cell or an adipocyte, and we form these kind of big fat oily cells, and then that adipose just sits there. Okay, and that adipose sits, and then that fat sits in there until we need it. Okay, and then if we're starving ourselves, or via exercise or just not eating enough calories, which is good because if you want to lose weight and burn fat, you do have to cut your calories. So then you're going to force your metabolism to break down this stored fat, and then you're going to lose some weight. And, typically, initially losing weight is not fun because it does kind of make you a little sick because you're flooding your system with more ketones, with more metabolic waste and junk. I mean, if you're doing this right and losing weight properly, you're not going to feel the best in the world right away. Okay, I'm not saying you're going to get sick, or you're puking your guts out or anything. It's just kind of an uncomfortable feeling. Okay. And there is no magic secret to weight loss and burning fat. It's as simple as this: calories in versus calories out. If you consume more calories than you burn, you are going to produce more fat, and you are going to store more fat. Okay, like I said, I don't care what the media says or all these magical dietary tips they have. Losing weight's as simple as that. Calories in versus calories out. Okay, so that's all triglycerides are. They're just they're a storage form of fat. I've already mentioned steroids, talked a little bit about proteins and carbs. So those are lipids. And last but not least, I'm going to talk more about nucleic acids later on in the next chapter when I talk about the cell cycle. But basically, nucleic acids are just the building blocks of DNA and RNA. Okay. And these nucleic acids, what they are, is they're basically a combination. They're basically a combination of a sugar and a phosphate group attached to it. Okay, DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, ribonucleic acid. So all they are, they're basically a sugar with a phosphate group attached to it. And then basically these nucleic acids join together, and you form this double helix that we call DNA. Okay. Nucleic acids are also found as part of ATP, when ATP is our cellular fuel. When we burn carbs, fats, or protein, okay, burning what we're doing when we say we're burning these, we're basically stripping, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen off of these molecules, and we're using them to form ATP. Okay, we're using them to form ATP. We're combining these with a sugar and we're forming ATP and some phosphates. Okay, so as a result, what happens then when we have an ATP molecule, that's, as I mentioned earlier, the workhorse of not the workhorse, but the fuel of the cell. Okay, the fuel source of the cell. Okay, so ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so what happens in a nutshell, when we start snapping phosphates off of an ATP molecule, that releases energy, and the cells can perform work like synthesizing a protein, carrying out a chemical reaction, whatever it may be. That's what we use ATP for. And I'm going to talk about ATP later on when I get more specifically into metabolism and aerobic versus anaerobic metabolism. Okay, but then, for now, that's all I really want you to think about nucleic acids as, are the building blocks of DNA, and it's an important component of ATP, a molecule that's used as cellular fuel. Okay, so again, that's kind of the end of chapter 2. If you have any questions about this chemistry stuff, ask away. I can't say that enough.